afternoon. Welcome all. As the scientific coordinator of the Center for Philosophy of Science of the University of Lisbon, it is my great pleasure to open the July session of our permanent seminar. Today's speaker will be Joan Bertran San-Millán. Joan recently joined our research center as an FCT researcher with a project on the formalization of logic in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I want to thank Joan for having accepted our invitation to this session. It is a great pleasure for us to have you with us, and particularly at our permanent seminar now. And welcome to the Center for Philosophy of Science, Joan. Sylvia, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. So, as usual, in this seminar, the speaker will have 45 minutes for the presentation, and then we will have the Q&A session. I will moderate the Q&A, and I will ask you to, if you want to ask a question, use the raise hand button, or if you prefer, just write in the chat that you want to ask a question, and I will give you the floor when it's your time. This is it. We are recording the presentation, but we will stop the recording for the Q&A session, so everybody can feel comfortable in speaking. This is it. Joan, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be in Lisbon, so thanks for the great welcome you have given me, and I'm also very happy to be today at the permanent seminar. So yeah. So I just wanted to thank you for the possibility of presenting my work. So I will start sharing my screen. Okay, so I hope you all see it.
Yes, perfectly.
So yeah, perfect. So when Sylvia contacted me for the invitation for presenting in this permanent seminar, I thought that it could be a good occasion to talk about the kind of things I have been working on lately. So I have been working on Peano's logic for some months now, and I started to think about because there's a lot of talk about early advocates of structuralism in the late 19th century mathematics. I mean, everyone talks about Dedekind and other authors, and one thing I noticed is that it seems that no one mentions Peano in this discussion. So I thought, since I have been working on Peano's logic for some time, it could be interesting to try to answer the question whether Peano could be considered to be one of the advocates of structuralism, at least the early versions of mathematical structuralism. So this is the context of my talk. And one thing I should mention as a preliminary remark is that in his works, Peano consistently avoided explaining his philosophical position. So there is very few occasions in which Peano does philosophy in a strict sense. So his philosophy has to be extracted from his presentation of mathematical theories, his methodology and remarks, which as I have said are very sparse, his remarks about his results. So the question of whether Peano was a structuralist can only be answered not from the philosophical side, but from the mathematical or methodological side. And in this, I rely on Reck and Price's distinction of methodological or mathematical structuralism and metaphysical or philosophical structuralism. So in the sense, Peano never tackled philosophically the issue of the nature of the abstract structures and relations that mathematical theories are purportedly about. This would be philosophical structuralism. So I will just restrict myself to consider whether Peano was a methodological or mathematical structuralism. And what do I understand by methodological structuralism? Again, I rely on someone else for this. I follow Schlim, which in a 2020 paper, he offered these two conditions for considering that some mathematician is a methodological structuralist, sorry. So first, methodological structuralism requires the study of the structural or relational features of the systems of objects that compose mathematical theories. So we are not looking into the intrinsic properties of the objects themselves. We are not trying to discover the properties of number 0 or the successor operation. We are trying to study the structural features, the structural properties of the system of objects, so of the system of, in this case, the natural numbers. And second, methodological structuralism also involves the consideration of a multiplicity of systems that have these structural features. And on purpose, I try to be very vague here because we'll see how some important differences can appear between several different structuralists, at least in the early stages of this philosophical position. So the aim of my talk is that I shall try to answer the question: was Peano a methodological structuralist? So did Peano fulfill these two conditions that I have just mentioned? And in this, I will focus on Peano's interpretation of the primitive notions and the axioms of geometry and arithmetic. So I will have to leave out of consideration several issues that are relevant for this question, in particular Peano's definitions by abstraction or Peano's notion of implicit definition. Other people have worked on it, and I think they have done very satisfactory work, so I will just focus on Peano's interpretation of the primitive notions. Just to clarify, by primitive notions, I understand these very basic and simple concepts that from which a theory is built on. So these concepts or notions that are used to define all the other notions that compose the scientific theory, in this case, a mathematical theory. So by studying Peano's endorsement to methodological structuralism, I shall distinguish two different phases that will help me explain this better, I hope. So in the first phase, I will focus on the determination of the primitive notions and the formulation of the axioms, as I said, of arithmetic and geometry. And in the second phase, I will focus on the schematic understanding of the axioms and the study of metatheoretical questions that I think will be particularly relevant for the question whether Peano was a structuralist. So I will just give you the structure of my talk. So this will reflect, in essence, these two phases. So in the first part of my talk, I will explain how Peano understands the primitive notions and what are the relations which is the relation between these notions and the axioms of geometry and arithmetic. In the second part, I will compare Peano's and Dedekind's construction of arithmetic, and I will see how this construction is different and why is this relevant for the question of whether Peano was a structuralist or not. And finally, in the third section, I will try to explain what is this schematic understanding of the axioms that I think Peano developed. And I will finish with some concluding remarks. So the first part, the primitive notions of geometry and arithmetic. So let's start with geometry. In Sui Fondamenti della Geometria, which was published in 1894, Peano selects as the primitive notions of geometry the concept of point and the relation between a point and a segment, which is stated as C, the point C lies between points A and B. So these are the two primitive notions, the most basic concepts of geometry, at least according to this presentation of geometry that Peano published in 1894. And Peano states that these notions are very simple ideas and also are common to all men. And there is also, I think, a relevant issue here, which is that for Peano defends the case that the properties of the primitive notions, which are articulated in geometrical laws and specifically in the axioms, must have an empirical foundation. So there is an empirical origin for these notions. And he says in this paper, anyone is allowed to allow these hypotheses he wants and develop the logical consequences contained in those hypotheses. But for this work, and he means his Fondamenti della Geometria, but for this work to deserve the name geometry, those hypotheses or postulates must express the result of the simplest and most elementary observations of physical figures. And in this regard, Peano shares Pasch's idea that the primitive notions of geometry are acquired empirically. So there is, as I said, an empirical origin for the primitive notions. Similarly, for the primitive notions of arithmetic, well, first, which are those in Arithmetic Principia Nova Method Exposita, which was published in 1889 and for some reason written in Latin. Peano states that the primitive notions of arithmetic are the notion of number or positive integer, the notion of one, the initial element of the numerical series, the numeric series, sorry, and the successor operation. And we will see that in later presentations, Peano switches to the notion of the concept of natural number and to the concept of zero. But we'll see that Peano presents the axiom in such a way that it's really not important whether we have positive integers or natural numbers or the initial number, or as our initial number, the number one or the number zero. So essentially we have, we would say nowadays, up to isomorphism, the same primitive notions. And then 2 years later in Sul Concetto di Numero, Peano poses the question of whether the primitive concepts of arithmetic can be defined. And he gives kind of two different answers. From a pedagogical or practical point of view, he states it is not convenient in teaching to give any definition of number. This idea, the notion of number, being very clear to students, and its definition having the effect of confusing it. And then from the theoretical point of view, he says, using only logical symbols, the number cannot be defined. Since it is evident that however those words, the words corresponding to logical constants, are combined, it will never be possible to have an expression equivalent to a number. So in this, at least implicitly, Peano rules out the possibility of defining in logical terms the notion of number. So Peano rejects Frege's and Russell's approach of giving explicit definitions of the notion of natural number. So according to Peano, the primitive terms of geometry and arithmetic, as we have seen, express known and recognizable notions. So every mathematician knows the notion of natural number, every mathematician knows the notion of point. And the primitive notions have a specific nature. In the case of geometry, it is acquired empirically and cannot be seen as structural entities. So we are referring to something specific when we are talking about the notion of natural number or the notion of point. And then being the basic components of these two mathematical theories, the primitive notions of geometry and arithmetic cannot be defined because we don't have any other components but themselves to define things in geometry and arithmetic. But Peano adds, they cannot even be described or elucidated according to scientific standards. So it's well known that for Frege, the basic notions of logic are the notions of object and the notion of function, at least in later works. And then in order to make these notions understandable for the reader, Frege offers some elucidations that were intended to make these notions at least, maybe not perfectly clear, but at least understandable for the reader. For Peano, this is not acceptable in scientific standards. So these notions, the basic notions of geometry and arithmetic, cannot even be described. So how can we construct these theories? Well, if no description of the fundamental concepts of geometry and arithmetic is possible, this is ruled out by Peano, these mathematical theories have to be constructed from axioms, to which Peano refers as primitive propositions. So what is the relationship between the primitive notions and the primitive propositions? Well, concerning geometry, in Sui Fondamenti della Geometria, Peano states the following. It will be necessary to determine the properties of the undefined entity P for point and of the relation C belongs to AB as C lies between A and B by means of axioms and postulates. The most elementary observation shows us a long series of properties of these entities. We just have to collect these common cognitions, order them, and enunciate as postulates only those that cannot be deduced from simpler ones. And concerning arithmetic, in Sul Concetto di Numero, Peano presents the axioms of arithmetic as the propositions which express the most simple properties of the even number. So the axioms are intended to express the properties of the primitive notions. But I would like to spend some time explaining this because I would like to study in more detail which are these properties. So exactly which are the properties we are expressing in the axioms. So let's see a particular example, the axioms of arithmetic. So in Arithmetic Principia Nova Method Exposita, famously Peano presents the first axiomatization in history of arithmetic. And then he offers several versions of these. He, as I said, changed he switched from the from number 1 to 0, from natural numbers, from positive integers to natural numbers, and then he he was refining these axioms, but they are essentially the same. So we can have a kind of a final list of axioms of arithmetic in the second part of the second volume of the Formulaire de Mathématiques, which is commonly known as the Formulario. So we have these 5 axioms of arithmetic, which are known as the Peano axioms. We have here some Peano notation, but we don't need to enter into the details of the notation. Essentially, according to the first axiom, we are saying that 0 belongs to the natural numbers. The second axiom states that the successor operation, which is here symbolized as the plus after the a, the successor operation is a function from the natural numbers to the natural numbers. According to the third axiom, we are saying that this function, the successor operation, is an injective function. So informally, that for any 2 different numbers, their successor cannot be the same. So 2 different numbers have different successors. The fourth axiom states that 0 is not the successor of any number. And finally, in the fifth axiom, we have which is known as the principle of mathematical induction. And well, this axiomatization, as I said, is essentially equivalent to that given in Sul Concetto di Numero in 1891. Okay, so what are the properties of the primitive notions we are stating here in these axioms? We are not offering the intrinsic properties, for instance, of the number 0. We are not characterizing this object and distinguishing it from other objects. We are just putting the number 0 in the context of the system, this structure set, the system of natural numbers. And for instance, we are saying things such as 0 is not the successor of any number. So 0 is not in this specific relation with the other elements of this set. So, we start these theories from axiom, but not in definition. But we are not characterizing the intrinsic properties of the primitive notions. This axiomatic construction characterizes relational or structural features. And in this, I don't think Peano's approach is at odds with his view that the primitive notions of geometry or arithmetic are specific entities which are accessible to mathematicians. Because I think a characterization of these notions by means of axioms that, as I said, state the structural properties, cannot be identified with an explicit definition. So I am defending here that Peano is not explicitly defining these notions. He's doing something else. He's establishing the relational features of the system of objects to which these notions belong. So I think according to this, Peano fulfills the first condition for methodological structuralism. So let's switch to the comparison between Dedekind and Peano. Okay, as you may know, Dedekind's construction of arithmetic, which was done in Was sind und was sollen die Zahlen, which was published in 1888. This construction starts from first, the description of the primitive logical concepts, which in Dedekind's case are, for instance, the notion of system, the notion of mapping, the relation of inclusion. And second, the explicit definition of the primitive notions of arithmetic. And we will see how Dedekind defines, for instance, the notion, the system of natural numbers, or the notion of a simply infinite set. And Peano is well aware, because he has already read Dedekind's theories when he published, for instance, Sul Concetto di Numero. Peano is well aware that his strategy to construct arithmetic is different to Dedekind's. However, in Sul Concetto di Numero, Peano concedes that these two different strategies, so the axiomatization or the explicit definition, coincide in their results. And Peano states, there is an apparent contradiction between the foregoing, so Peano's axiomatization of arithmetic, and what Dedekind says, which should be noticed immediately. Here, in Peano's paper, the number is not defined, but its fundamental properties are stated. Dedekind defines the number instead and specifically calls number what satisfies the aforementioned conditions. Evidently, the two things coincide. And I would like now to study a little bit how Peano interpreted his axiomatization. So I will give an early account of Peano's interpretation of his own axioms, and then a later account. And we'll see how, to what extent these passages can be interpreted as a structuralist mathematics. So again, in Sul Concetto di Numero, after presenting the axioms, Peano states the following. He says, these propositions, meaning the axioms of arithmetic, express the necessary and sufficient conditions so that the entities of a system can be put in an unequivocal correspondence with a series of n meaning the system of natural numbers, and can be stated as follows. First, a specific entity of the system is given the name 1. 2, let an operation be defined such that to every entity A of the system, there corresponds another, A+, which in the axioms is the successor of number A, also of the system. 3, that two entities whose correspondent are equal. 4, the entity named 1 does not correspond to any entity. And finally, that the system of natural numbers, also this n, is a class common to all the classes S that contain the individual 1, and that when they contain an individual, they also contain the correspondent. So you see here that this is not only an informal rendering of the axioms, but it is a rendering that separates the axioms from their specific meaning. We are not talking anymore about the specific numbers and specific relations between these numbers. We are talking about entities whatsoever, relations between entities and their correspondent, and classes which are not anymore specified. So by means of his axiomatization of arithmetic, Peano characterizes any system because structural properties are those of the system of natural numbers. And actually, Peano suggests that there might be other systems besides the system of natural numbers which satisfy the axioms, or at least satisfy these conditions as are stated here. And in Peano's axiomatization, I think it is important to notice that the system of natural numbers, which is referred as n, is assumed to be given. So the system is not obtained by abstraction from the systems that have the structural properties expressed by the axioms, by the primitive propositions. So let's see a later account of the axioms in Peano's works. So we go back to the second volume of the second part of the second volume of the Filosofia, where Peano, after presenting the axioms, the primitive propositions of arithmetic, states the following. He says, these primitive propositions, the necessity of which we have seen, are sufficient to deduce all the properties of the numbers which we will meet in the following. He means all the theorems that follow the presentation of the axioms. But there is an infinite number of systems which satisfy all the primitive propositions. For example, they are all verified if we replace n sub 0, meaning natural numbers, and 0, with n sub 1, which is the set of positive integers, and 1. All the systems which satisfy the 5 primitive propositions are in mutual correspondence with the number. The number, n sub 0, is what is obtained by abstraction from all these systems. In other words, the number is the system which has all and only the properties stated by the 5 primitive propositions. So now we see an explicit recognition there is not only a multiplicity of systems that satisfy the axioms, but even an infinity of systems that satisfy the axioms are in correspondence, in mutual correspondence with the system of natural numbers. So again, here I would like to clarify how abstraction is understood. I think, or at least I defend, that abstraction here is not understood as a process that creates or verifies some abstract entities, in this case, the natural numbers, which is something that would be thematized by, for instance, Dedekind or Canton. For Peano, abstraction is a limitation of the properties of the elements of the systems considered. So we are considering a multiplicity of elements, and we are separating or limiting the properties we are dealing with in a particular moment. So it is convenient to clarify some apparent tension in Peano's structural properties of his axiomatization of arithmetic, because we've seen that in some respects it's very close to Dedekind, but in some other respects it is not. So on the one hand, I have stated that Peano rejects the definition of the primitive notions of arithmetic, while Peano explicitly defines them. But on the other hand, Peano's account of the role of the axioms of arithmetic seems to put him in almost complete allegiance with Dedekind's position in Basile, Basile, and Ditzalen. And actually, Peano recognizes that there is a multitude of structural systems which share the relational features expressed by the axioms of arithmetic. So I would like to compare specifically Dedekind's definition of a simple infinite set and Peano's axiomatization of arithmetic, and see in what sense they can be seen to be different or coincident. So let's see first Dedekind's definition of a simple infinite set, which in a sense satisfies the notion of the system of natural numbers. So as Dedekind says, a system n is said to be simply infinite when there exists a similar mapping phi of n into itself such that n appears as the chain of an element not containing phi of n. The essence of a simply infinite system n consists in the existence of a mapping phi of n and an element 1 which satisfy the following conditions alpha, beta, gamma, and delta. So alpha n prime is part of n. So the image, according to this mapping phi of n is contained in n. Second, n is the chain of 1. Gamma, the element 1, is not contained in n prime. And finally, delta, the mapping phi is similar, which is another way of saying that phi is an injective function. So this is just another way of expressing the information given by the axioms of arithmetic stated by Peano, which are just to refresh them, these 5 axioms. So we are saying essentially the same. We are giving the same information, but I think there is an important difference in presentation, which is relevant for our purposes. In Dedekind's definition of a simply infinite set, the notions involved are presented as bound variables. So you see here, wait, can I see it here, that Dedekind is talking about there is a mapping phi, there is an element 1. All these notions, the notion of mapping, the notion of element, the notion of system, are quantified. And they are not specified as this specific system, this specific mapping. It's any mapping whatsoever which has these properties. Dedekind's definition in this sense is substantive because it involves the basic notions of the theory in which the theory is set, namely the theory of classes. So these bound variables refer to mappings, systems, and elements, which are the basic notions of the theory of classes that Dedekind is departing from. And then the primitive terms in Peano's axiomatization of arithmetic should be seen as non-logical constants associated with the standard interpretation. So again, if we look at this axiomatization, we don't see the a quantification of 0, of n sub 0, or of the plus symbol. These are not quantified. These are non-logical constants which are attached to a very specific interpretation, which is their standard interpretation. The numeral 0 refers to number 0, n sub 0 refers to the system of natural numbers, and the plus symbol in this case refers to the successor operation. The systems that satisfy the axioms are the result of considering alternative interpretations of the axioms, and specifically alternative interpretations of the primitive terms that refer to the basic notions of arithmetic. The systems are not obtained by means of an instantiation from the general definitions, as in Dedekind's case. So Dedekind's definition is general enough so that it encompasses the case of natural numbers, but also other possible, we would say nowadays, models for the system of natural numbers. So Dedekind provides the definition, I would call it a definition of a higher level notion. Instead of defining specifically natural numbers, Dedekind offered the definition of this notion of a simply infinite system that of which one particular instantiation is the system of natural numbers. And then Peano doesn't offer a definition, offers what I would call a schematic axiomatization. And in this terminology, and in this account, I agree with Kleb, who applies this idea to the comparison between Dedekind and Hilbert in his 2011 paper. And also, I think we disagree with Ferreiros, who thinks that as far as there is a common logical background, these two approaches can be seen to be equivalent. Okay, so what do we do with this multiplicity of systems that satisfy the axioms? Well, Peano does not investigate at all the nature of the class of structure sets that satisfy the axioms. He just assumes that these sets, these structural sets, share the structural property, but he does not pursue any justification of their isomorphism. There is no investigation of whether the system of natural numbers this theory is categorical or not. But this is exactly Dedekind's purpose in sections 132 to 134 of Was in und was sollen die Zahlen. So in this context, Peano's methodological structuralism is very limited, and is limited to the only recognizing that the axioms of arithmetic can be satisfied by, intuitively, he says, in infinitely many systems of objects, and that's it. And in this regard, Dedekind's structuralism goes way beyond that. So the second condition of methodological structuralism in the case of Dedekind is way more developed than Peano. But still, I think we can find this idea that Peano recognizes a multiplicity of systems He claims they are infinite, but he doesn't offer any proof for that. A multiplicity of systems that satisfy the axioms. And I think the modern scope of Peano's structuralist position, at least concerning the second condition, could be explained by the fact that for him, the primitive notions of arithmetic are specific entities that are accessible and recognizable to any mathematician. Okay, so let's turn to the third part of my talk, this schematic understanding of the axioms. And I will tackle this question from two sides. So I will talk first about what can be seen as deductivism. So why does Peano offer this schematic understanding of the axioms? And first, I think it is important to see how he derives the theorems of arithmetic. So once the axioms of arithmetic we have seen are established, Peano seems to view them as formal postulates from which theorems are obtained by means of logical inference. So the derivation of theorems for Peano of mathematical theory, and specifically here of arithmetic, is a purely logical procedure with no reference to the specific meaning of the propositions involved. So we just specify logical means to obtain new theorems, and then we operate with the axioms as if they were formal postulates with no content whatsoever. In a paper published in 1900 in Formule de logique mathématique, Peano states that a demonstration is reduced to a series of transformations according to the rules mentioned, in this case, logical rules of reasoning. And these transformations are analogous to algebraic rules for solving a system of equations. So an almost mechanical procedure that allows us to obtain new theorems. And in this, as I was saying, Peano echoes deductivism, which was particularly prominent in late 18th and 19th century mathematics. Advocates of deductivism defend the elimination of all traces of intuition in mathematical proofs by disregarding the meaning of the symbols in deductions. And I think this is present in Peano's account. And then there is this German mathematician Pasch, which Peano knew and quoted in his works. Pasch expresses his deductivist position in geometry in this Vorlesungen über neuere Geometrie, which was published in 1882. According to him, the relationships between concepts are taken to be logical and thus are established by means of logical laws. But there is an interesting difference between Pasch and Peano, because Pasch does not make explicit these logical laws involved in mathematical deductions. So when he talks about logical relationships between concepts, which are established by means of logical laws, he doesn't specify which are these logical laws or logical relationships. But this is one of the main aspects involved in Peano's symbolization of mathematical theory. So Peano develops a mathematical logic which allows him to derive new theorems. And I think it's important to have this in mind. Okay, so let's turn to the other side of this schematic understanding of the axiom. So why does Peano develop this schematic understanding? Well, because there is a very specific mathematical context that Peano was interested in solving, which is determining the independence of the axioms of arithmetic. So by this, so it was quite common in 19th century mathematics to prove that the axioms of a specific theory, specifically, for instance, geometry, but also in arithmetic in this case, were all independent of each other, which means that each of the axioms cannot be derived from the other axioms. And the main method, at least for Peano and Peano's school, for proving independence was what is known as the method of exemplification, which in this quote of the second part of the second volume of the Formulario, Peano characterizes. So the exemplification method allows us to prove the independence of one of the axioms from the other by offering an example that makes true one of the axioms, makes false one of the axioms, but satisfy the rest. And then we are proving that this specific axiom, which is made false by this example, is independent of the others. And Peano says, in order to recognize the independence of a primitive proposition of one of the axioms, it is enough to give an interpretation to the primitive symbols, in this case, the numeral 0, n sub 0, and the plus symbol, such that all primitive propositions which are different from the one considered are verified. So this is specifically the method of exemplification. The absolute independence of the primitive propositions 1 to 5 is proved by the following 5 examples. And then we don't need to go into the details of all 5, but just as a matter of example, let's see, for instance, the second case. So the second axiom of arithmetic states that the successor operation is a function from the natural numbers to the natural numbers. And as a means to show that this axiom is independent of the others, Peano gives the following example. If, by preserving the usual meaning of 0 and plus and n sub 0, and here plus is not the sum, but again, the successor refers to the successor operation, and n sub 0 is given the meaning digit or the set of numbers 0, 1, 2 to 9, all conditions except the second are satisfied. And why is that? Well, because the successor of 9 is 10, but 10 is not a digit, doesn't belong to this n sub 0 according to this interpretation. 10 is a concatenation of the two digits 1 and 0, so it doesn't belong to n sub 0 according to this interpretation. So in this case, the successor operation, as it is interpreted according to this example, does not satisfy the axiom saying that the successor operation is a function from n sub 0 to n sub 0. The fourth axiom states that 0 is not the successor of any number. So 0 does not belong to the codomain of the successor operation. And then in order to prove the independence of the axiom, Peano gives this example. A periodic system, for instance, the astronomic hours of the day, where the hour that follows 23 is 0, does not satisfy condition 4. Why is that? Because the successor of 23, the hour that follows 23 is 0. So after the 11th at night, we go to midnight. And then 0 in this case is the successor of a number, which makes false the fourth axiom, stating that 0 is not the successor of any number. So this is how Peano proves the independence of the axioms of arithmetic. So the primitive terms of arithmetic used in the axiomatization, which are, again, the numeral 0, n sub 0, and the symbol plus, that are to be understood in these examples as schematic letters. So letters completely devoid of meaning, which can acquire a meaning given, in a sense, externally. So each example provides a meaning for 0, n sub 0, and plus, and according to this interpretation, it can be determined whether each axiom is satisfied or not. So there is, I think, a direct connection between the determination of the independence of each primitive proposition and the adoption of a specific interpretation of the non-logical constants occurring in it. So again, I see the primitive terms occurring in the axioms as non-logical constants, which are associated with the standard interpretation. But as we have seen, this standard interpretation can be completely ruled out and can be the symbols can be assigned another interpretation. So Peano recognizes a variety of systems which satisfy the axioms and thus share the structural properties with the system of natural numbers. So Peano again fulfills the second condition for methodological structuralism. And I think this is possible, as I have tried to explain, by means of first, the adoption of a deductivist position, and second, the acknowledgement that the axioms can receive alternative interpretations as a method to prove the independence of the axioms. So I'll just finish with some concluding remarks. By studying Peano's construction of geometry and arithmetic, I have provided textual evidence that supports, I think, the claim that Peano was indeed a methodological structuralist. So possibly not a philosophical structuralist, because there is no philosophy in Peano's works. He doesn't devote any time explaining the nature of these structures that we call natural numbers, but still I think there is enough evidence to claim that Peano was a methodological structuralist, so a mathematical structuralist. In the first part of my talk, I have argued that Peano focused on the specification of the relational features of the system of objects of geometry and arithmetic and about. For Peano, the primitive notions of geometry and arithmetic are specific entities that still cannot be defined. I have also stated that since these notions cannot be defined or elucidated, geometry and arithmetic have to begin in axioms, and the axioms of geometry and arithmetic express, according to Peano, the structural properties of the primitive notions. In the second part of the talk, I claim that Peano's construction of arithmetic should be distinguished from Dedekind's. They share some common features, but still they should be distinguished because for Peano, the system of natural numbers is given and not created by abstraction. Also, that Peano's construction of arithmetic starts with axioms and not with express definitions, as is the case with Dedekind. And then accordingly, Peano's axioms of arithmetic should not be identified with a higher level definition, which is what Dedekind provides. The terms involved in Peano's axioms are not presented as bound variables, but as non-logical constants. And finally, in the third part of the talk, I think I have at least tried to justify that Peano considered a multitude of systems that have the structural properties expressed by the axioms. He says that there's an infinity of systems, but he doesn't offer any proof for that. Peano adopted a deductivist approach, according to which the axioms are seen as formal postulates, completely devoid of meaning. And Peano's proofs of independence of the axioms of arithmetic involve considering alternative interpretations of the primitive terms, which in turn determine systems that satisfy the axioms. And in this, accordingly, I think the second condition for methodological structuralism is satisfied in Peano's case. So just to, I have listed here all the references I have used in my talk, and well, just thank you all, and that's it.